Hello and welcome everyone. It's Desi, and we are back again for another episode of Frasier. This time, episode 2 of season 1. It is called Space Quest. And just to get right into it, because I think the last one took a little bit long, I'm just going to go right into it. So hopefully we can cut up some time. I ended up going on for like 26 minutes, so let's cut this down a little bit. This one opens with a very groggy Frasier waking up, yawning, etc. And Daphne and Martin are already up, making breakfast and running around. Daphne ends up greeting him, and she's like cleaning stuff, and she's just like, "Oh, hi, Dr. Crane." And she just starts like going on and on about stuff, how generous he is for having his dad stay with him. Daphne likes to talk a lot, and it's a theme. And Frasier is tired and cranky, which for me, I am not a morning person either, so I completely understand it. But Frasier's just very like gruff with her, and he's just basically after she keeps going on and on and on, he just tells her to be quiet after asking like, "Who are you?" Like, is she thought this whole thing was a bad dream. He's still like getting used to living with people. So anyway, Frasier goes into the kitchen and gets his coffee, and it turns out that Daphne has gone into basically tamper with his coffee. She puts allspice and eggshells in it to make it a little milder and give it a little bit of a kick. And of course, Frasier, being the routine person that he is in the morning, it's just he's looking forward to his coffee, and Daphne completely messed it up by putting that in there. And so he's not happy about it. Meanwhile, Martin is making his breakfast, which is very nice of Martin, but unfortunately, Martin gives him bacon and eggs and toast, and there's bacon has a lot of grease in it, and Frasier like has a very healthy breakfast sort of thing. So Frasier just is not happy about that and is upset at Martin, even though Martin made him breakfast, which is super nice of Martin. But Frasier's just cranky and ungrateful. He doesn't have his coffee. He doesn't have his peace and quiet. So he goes to get his newspaper, and basically it's not on by his door. So he freaks out and yells at one of his neighbors and thinks that she stole it. And it turns out Daphne already got it, which was nice of Daphne. But Frasier's just like, well, I wanted a fresh newspaper, which is just Frasier being really picky again. He's just pissed off about this whole thing about losing his independence and freedom. He goes to read the newspaper, and then Eddie jumps up on the seat next to him and just stares at him because that's what Eddie does. And Frasier just starts like yelling at the dog, and it's a pretty funny scene. And so Frasier just like storms out and goes to work after his morning is essentially ruined by these people. And ironically enough, the theme for the episode is intrusion. And the first caller is an agoraphobic person who actually turns out to be one of the actors for Superman, which I learned about afterwards. Christopher Reeve. Yes, Christopher Reeve was the actual caller here, which is what's interesting. Talking about agoraphobia, and Frasier's just like, well, you need to talk to a professional. I can only do so much on the air. But he says, you are not alone. And the guy says, well, I am alone, because he's an agoraphobic. And it's kind of funny, and Frasier just like rolls his eyes and like, yeah, get professional help. I can't do anything on the air for you. And interestingly enough, he talks to Roz, who's on the phone with her mom. I'm mixing all of this up. So he's looking forward to reading his book in solitude, since in his studio it's soundproof, and he can finally read his book, which he's been trying to read. But Martin and Daphne and everybody at the house is just making all this noise, so he can't read his book in solitude. But anyways, as he's getting ready to read his book, this Bulldog Briscoe guy comes in, who's a recurring theater character later on. He's just this super loud sports podcast, not pod. I don't know why I say podcast. The podcast didn't even exist in 1993. He's not a podcaster. He's a sports commentator who does an on-air show. Like, this is radio. And so Bulldog is the guy here to the left. He's just this really loud, kind of obnoxious guy, very much an opposite to Frasier. Very like likes to get nice and close, and Frasier's a very distant sort of person. So this is just a really good picture of just like oh my gosh, I heard your episode about this guy, and Briscoe or Bulldog is like, well, he should have done sports. His solution is, oh, just do sports and everything will be fine. Do contact sports, and that'll fix things apparently, because that's his idea of releasing frustration. So Frasier gets back home, and to his surprise, there's nobody there, and he's just like, oh my gosh, I finally get to read my book. And one thing I wanted to note, as he is leaving the studio, Roz was talking with her mom about sex, which was really interesting. And Roz has a very progressive view on sex, as I like to say, and that's something that'll become more and more evident as the show goes on. We're only getting bits and pieces about the individual characters. The show is very much, the screen time is dominated by Frasier and Martin at this point, and a little bit of Daphne, but like 80% of it's Frasier. Well, actually, it's all about Frasier, so he almost has 100% of the screen time, and Martin probably has 40 to 50% maybe, or 30 to 40. So we're learning more about the characters. We learn a little bit more about Roz. Daphne gets plenty of screen time, so we're learning more and more about her. But anyways, so Frasier's wants to go read his book outside in a park because obviously loud, obnoxious Bulldog has taken over the studio, and of course it's raining and thundering outside. And this is just me going off with a bit of an aside. Is Seattle does not get a lot of thunder, and it only really rains in the wintertime. That is a stereotype about Seattle, and this show, as much as I love it, has a lot of stereotypes about Seattle weather, and this is me just going off on a tangent. It doesn't thunderstorm here very much. The foothills and the mountains get a lot of thunderstorms. Seattle itself maybe gets 3 or 4 thunderstorms a year. So there you go. But anyway, Frasier gets home, it's raining outside, and nobody's there, and he's just ecstatic. He's like, oh my gosh, this is like a dream come true. I finally get to read my book. Hence the episode Space Quest, by the way. It's his quest to find space to read his book in quiet. And as soon as he sits down, this is where I picked this caption, the door opens and what was he said? The door opens and Martin, Eddie, and the dog come in. And he calls his dad Mary Poppins and the dog from hell is what he calls the trio. And he's just like, dang it, I can't get any peace. Frasier ends up having an argument with his dad because his dad's like, oh, what are you reading? And Frasier's just like, shut up, I'm trying to read this book. And his dad's like, you're being really sensitive and being really rude. Like, I mean, you're being, and Martin says, Frasier, you were always a fussy kid, and you've only gotten worse with age. And this is kind of a reveal. And I do want to point out that as someone who is a book reader, I understand where Frasier's coming from. Like, especially when I get a new book and I want to read, and I keep getting distracted by people, it can be really, really frustrating. So this is relatable to me, but to a lot of people, it's just like, oh my gosh, Frasier, you're being such a freaking priggish prude. Like, get over yourself. You're trying to get closer to your dad, but yet you don't want him around because you just want to read books and have quiet time. So, interesting, an interesting conundrum that he's in. So Frasier goes to the coffee shop. Finally, he's able to read his book, finds a nice little secluded over in the corner there, and then Niles comes in, and Frasier says, oh my gosh, what fresh hell is this? Which I believe is a Shakespearean quote. And Niles is like, oh my gosh, what's your problem? You should be happy to see me, because Niles and Frasier are very close, even though they have sibling rivalry. And so Frasier's, I'm so sorry, Niles, I'm just trying to read this book, and the book is called The Holotropic Mind. And this is a frame of the book. And it's very pseudoscience sort of thing, so it's kind of interesting that Frasier would be reading it. It has, the author talks a lot about LSD. The author's a psychotherapist, so it's a little bit left field for Frasier. And I actually did some research on the book, and the criticism is it has Freudian leanings and has no science to back it up. So It does look like a pretty decent book and a lot of new age thought, but at the same time, it is kind of kooky. So it's actually a little bit surprising that Frasier would be reading it. And Niles ends up spoiling the book for him. So Frasier's mad about that. And he's like, oh, well, I wanted to read this book, and Niles just spoiled it because, of course, Niles has read it because Niles reads everything because he's like a genius. So Frasier and Niles have a serious conversation about their dad. And Frasier's just like, well, I want to get closer to dad, but he's always interfering with my routines. And Niles says, well, Niles basically reframes his argument and his frustration, saying, what you're saying is that you want to be closer to dad, but you don't actually want to be around him. And this makes Frasier think, and he's like, well, gosh, you're right. I've been pushing him away. I need to fix this. And what I love about Niles' character is even though Niles is very neurodivergent, has OCD tendencies, always wiping his chair down, and is extremely like prickly and cold, he's also very like down to earth and can analyze situations and is very much the voice of reason. Again, why this character is so amazing and why he's my favorite character. He's right up there with some of the characters from The Sopranos. Is my favorite TV character of all time. So I love this. But that's my side on Niles. Frasier gets back and he's like, Dad, we need to talk. And his dad's like, oh, I don't want to do this. I don't want to talk about it. I'm already over. They had this argument earlier, and Martin's like, oh, I'm already over. I don't care. It's just this very toxic masculine thing of being like, I don't want to deal with this crap. We had our argument. It's been settled. Let's just move on. But Frasier's like, no, we need to sort this through. This is really bothering me. And Frasier basically puts a clock down and says, we're going to talk for 3 minutes. Just sit down. And immediately Martin says, oh, well, this is stupid. And Frasier's just like, okay, Dad, way to start this good conversation off. You're being ridiculous. And they end up having another big argument, and his dad calls Frasier an egghead, calls him an elitist, and Frasier calls Martin cold and unapproachable, which is very ironic considering that Frasier is this this very prim elitist type. So very ironic and almost feels like a bit of projection. So they have another argument, but there is a reconciliation where Martin, again being the voice of reason despite him being a flawed character, is like, you know what, Frasier, I understand what you're trying to do. I understand that you want to get closer to me, but it's going to take time, and I'm willing to put the effort forward if you are. And Frasier's like, I am too. Let's watch your favorite program, which just came on. That's why they had to cut their little talk short. And Martin's like, you know what? Let's have a beer. And it's a really special father and son moment where you get to see them actually hanging out and chilling for a little bit and watching Martin's favorite show, which is pretty cool. And that ends the episode. And the final episode or the final scene with the end credits is Frasier finally finding a place to read his book in solitude, which is the storage unit. And I get it. I live out in the country, so there's lots of places where I can go read a book. But if I was in the city, I could definitely see myself doing this, especially if it's a really good book and I'm living with loud people. So anyway, that's the end of Space Quest. I think it's a really good episode. I think all these episodes are really good. I don't enjoy it as much as the first one, but there are a lot of good moments in it. So overall, pretty good. Ages pretty well. I really do like getting to know a lot more about Roz, and I like the relationship that Niles and Frasier has, as Niles is a voice of reason despite being so odd in a lot of ways. Niles is very intelligent but very odd. I like that. He's like he's like a higher tier of Sheldon Cooper. Like if Sheldon Cooper was written, I know a lot of people might like that show, but I feel like Niles is a better written Sheldon Cooper. So that's my 2 cents on that. Thank you all for watching. Let me see how long this one was. All right, 14 minutes. I cut it down by 10 minutes. I'm getting better. Anyways, thank you. Peace.